preparing for the midterms and turning to the former president.
This is not a time for Republicans to fold.
A look at the Trump effect on the upcoming election. Plus,
this pandemic does start to wear on us.
But hope could be on the horizon as cases fall. The latest on the coronavirus crisis in the United States. And the U.S. and the Taliban hold their first talks since the chaotic American troop withdrawal in Afghanistan. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Can a former president lead the Republican Party to big wins in upcoming elections? Good evening and thanks for joining us for Faith Nation. I'm Heather Sells in for John and Jenna tonight. Well, President Trump makes a splash in Iowa over the weekend. This as speculation swirls about whether or not he will run again and what role he'll play in the 2022 midterm elections now just over a year away. CBN's Tara Mergener is here now with more. Tara.
Republicans want to make the midterms all about President Biden and the crises they insist he's created. Pundits say Democrats' best chance of keeping seats is to put all the focus on Donald Trump.
Hello, Iowa.
President Trump all smiles for his first Iowa rally since the 2020 election, quickly calling out President Biden and his party over political and economic failures.
After just 9 months under Biden, violent criminals and bloodthirsty gangs are taking over our streets. Illegal aliens and deadly drug cartels are taking over our borders. Inflation is taking over our economy.
Flanked by several influential Republicans while addressing the crowd of thousands, Trump is vowing to help the GOP sweep Democrats from their majority.
We must pour every ounce of our energy into winning a historic victory in the midterm.
Trump believes Republicans will win big with his supporters because he expanded the GOP base, which he acknowledged in his speech at CPAC in February.
We will lead the conservative movement and the Republican Party back to victory, and it will be a greater victory than this party has ever had.
RNC spokesperson Paris Denardin says Trump will definitely play a role in 2022.
When it comes to electing Republican candidates, his support is important.
So will be the Republicans' midterm advantage, that being the party of the president historically loses seats in Congress. If Biden follows the path of other recent presidents, he'll spend political capital navigating crises, including a botched withdrawal from Afghanistan and soaring illegal entries into the U.S., and lose supporters in the process.
I'm not sure we're ever going to have a clear idea about who has a firm control because the majority is so narrow. And in the House, we're in a holding pattern because we are in a redistricting cycle. And the states have not yet finalized their new congressional maps. So we don't know what the districts look like.
Meanwhile, Biden's approval numbers keep sinking. Quinnipiac showing him at just 38% approval, with the majority saying his administration is not competent to run the government. The White House again blaming the pandemic.
This is a really tough time in our country. We're still battling COVID, and a lot of people thought we'd be through it, including us.
Now, Republicans need to gain just 1 seat in the Senate and 5 in the House to take back the majority. The main battleground states are Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Heather.
Tara, in just a few weeks, Virginia voters will elect their next governor, a race said to be a precursor of the midterms. How has President Trump played into that election?
Yeah, for sure, Heather. All eyes are on this Virginia race. Well, you know, Glenn Youngkin is walking a very fine line here, and he knows that he appreciates the Trump endorsement, he says, but he's got to keep the independent vote to win this race. Independent voters may or may not like Donald Trump, but he's also got to keep Trump's loyal base. And if he doesn't pay homage to Trump, it would be not out of the question for them to be upset with him and not cast their vote in his favor. So, Heather, it is a very tight race here. it gets closer all the time, with Youngkin taking the advantage little by little, and there's not a lot of room for error. And by the way, President Trump has said that if Youngkin does not fully embrace MAGA, he may lose this race. So he's not at all happy that Youngkin is kind of doing the balancing act here.
Well, fascinating to watch that. Tara, thanks for your reporting. And Chief Political Analyst David Brody here for more now. David, a lot of eyes on Iowa this weekend. Senator Chuck Grassley said, quote, if I didn't accept the endorsements of a person that's got 91% of the Republican voters in Iowa, I wouldn't be too smart. But Grassley previously spoke out against Trump in February, saying that Trump argued that the election was stolen and, quote, he belittled and harassed elected officials across the country to get his way. So now Grassley's accepting Trump's endorsement, but we know others in the GOP want nothing to do with him and the stolen election narrative. How important do you see the president's endorsement being for GOP candidates in 2022?
It's crucial. I mean, it's everything. And Grassley's he's not stupid. As a matter of fact, he's 88 years old. And when you get older, you realize you just kind of speak the truth like you know the truth. And he knows the truth, which is that if he rejected the Trump endorsement, then he can retire to an Iowa farm because he won't be in the Senate. So it's really that simple for Grassley, though a lot of people will call him hypocritical. But what does he care? He's 88, so he's going to let it rip anyhow. He doesn't care what liberals in D.C. think.
Is there any variance across the country? I mean, is everyone, feeling like they're desperate for his support, or do you see some pockets where it might play out where someone who's opposed to Trump can actually win?
I think there are levels of desperation, but I think overall the general rule is indeed that Trump and a Trump endorsement means everything. Just look at the polling. I mean, 90% plus of Republicans support this president. And though it might dip in left and right, or I guess a little bit left in certain areas, ultimately it doesn't matter. This is Trump's party. Anybody that thinks it's not is fooling themselves.
Well, I want to ask you, we also know that of the 40 endorsements he's given, 17 are for Republicans who are counting primary challenges against sitting Republican lawmakers. Is this the way of former president's way of playing payback?
Yeah, for sure. And look, a lot of it has to do with election integrity. I mean, if you look at the Secretary of State races that he's endorsed. Now, remember, for former presidents to get involved in Secretary of State races just doesn't happen. Heather, it just doesn't happen. But he's doing it. Where is he doing it? In Georgia, in Arizona, in Michigan. What's the common theme there? Election integrity and the concern that Trump has had all along with people like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, and the list goes on. So that's his method of operation, if you will, and that's his litmus test.
All right. And just briefly, we know that he had this big event in Iowa over the weekend. It looked like a campaign event. What's the latest thinking on whether he himself will run?
He's in. I mean, look, I can't make it official because there's just in. I don't work for the campaign. But look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that he's in. As a matter of fact, I asked him about a month ago as we put on CBN News. I said, what would make you not run? He said, well, I guess a bad call from a doctor. Hey, look, if the only reason you're not going to run is a bad call from the doctor, you're in. Get ready. Buckle up.
David Brody, we're buckled up. Thanks so much for your time.
You bet.
Well, breaking news today in the fight against the coronavirus, the pharmaceutical company Merck is asking the FDA to authorize its new pill for COVID treatment. This comes as the U.S. sees COVID cases and hospitalizations declining. John Jessup has more on the fight against the pandemic.
A pill that effectively treats COVID-19 could be on the market soon. Drug maker Merck requested FDA authorization Monday for its COVID pill, claiming the data shows it reduces risk of hospitalization and death by 50% if it's taken soon after onset of symptoms.
In the placebo group, there were 8 deaths, and in the treatment group, there were no deaths. That's also very important and very good news.
Dr. Fauci maintains vaccination is the best defense against the virus, pointing to falling infections and hospitalizations as proof.
It's good news that we're starting to see a turning around of the curve and coming down. That is not an excuse to walk away from the issue of needing to get vaccinated.
Fauci predicts numbers will continue to fall through the colder months, and with the layer of protection coming from vaccinated parents, he says trick-or-treating outdoors should be safe this Halloween. Meanwhile, in the battle against vaccine mandates, the man in charge of the country's largest sheriff's department says he's not enforcing vaccine requirements for his employees.
I'm not forcing anyone. The issue has become so politicized, there are entire groups of employees that are willing to be fired and laid off rather than get vaccinated.
And with the Pentagon's November 28th mandate deadline approaching, the military's overall vaccination rate is climbing. Stats show, however, about a third of the Marine Corps and more than 60,000 members of the Air Force have yet to get the shot. John Jessup, CBN News.
And we turn now to CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson. Lori, let's start with Merck's petition to the FDA today to issue this emergency use authorization for its antivirus COVID treatment. What does this drug do, and what sets it apart from other potential treatment options?
Well, a lot of people can understand what it does if they look at the drug called Tamiflu. Tamiflu is the same type of drug. It's an antiviral pill, and Tamiflu is used to treat the flu, not COVID, but this new drug is just like what Tamiflu is to the flu. And basically, as an antiviral pill, what it does is it stops the replication of the virus in your body. And so that's why it's really important that you take the pill as soon as possible after the onset of symptoms, ideally within 24 hours, 48, 72 hours, possibly. And so this is a great advancement. Not only is Merck working on getting this drug approved, Roche and Pfizer are also in late-stage trials with their antiviral pills. So this will be a fantastic breakthrough for the treatment of COVID. It might be available as soon as the end of the year. Until then, there's already a fantastic treatment available to people, and it's a monoclonal antibody, and it is 70% effective at resisting keeping people out of the hospital, I should say. It's called Regeneron, and the only drawback to some of the patients is it is an infusion, but it's very effective, and it is free. It's paid for by the government and is FDA approved.
These advancements, in light of the fact that we see hospitalizations and death rates declining, what should we anticipate right now as the colder months approach?
Well, it's really interesting because we have seen a number of experts saying that we have actually gone over that peak of the Delta variant, and we are now on the downside. And so that's fantastic news. And even, Heather, some experts are saying that this Delta surge is the last surge we might see with the coronavirus. Hallelujah. Wouldn't that be great? And they're saying that the coronavirus is not going to be gone for good, but it's going to be more of, instead of a pandemic, an endemic, something that we see come around every year. So as far as what's going to happen after we get over this Delta peak, what's going to happen this winter, it remains to be seen. You know, a lot of people are vaccinated. A lot of people have natural immunity. So unless you have natural immunity and unless you're vaccinated, you still run that risk, especially getting together with relatives over the holidays. But hopefully we won't see the terrible death toll that we saw last January and February, last winter.
All right, Lori, and just briefly, Halloween is around the corner. Dr. Fauci is out talking about it, saying it's okay for kids to trick or treat. What are some of the best ways to keep everyone safe around Halloween?
Well, the key, of course, is just stay outside. So at my church, for example, we have trunk or treat where we're in the parking lot, so outside, and the kids go from car to car. Remember, kids make up 1/4 of all COVID infections these days, so kids can still get it and are still getting it. So best to keep the kids who are not vaccinated from these indoor settings where they're all grouped together closely.
All right, makes sense. CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson, thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, a reign of terror makes a return in Afghanistan. What it means for Christians. Candid and professional, that is how the State Department is describing weekend talks between the United States and the Taliban. It was the first time representatives have met face-to-face since the U.S. finished withdrawing all its troops from Afghanistan and the chaotic scene that played out as that came about. Leaving the talks, the Taliban ruled out cooperating with the U.S. on trying to contain radical groups like ISIS, but it did say the U.S. has agreed to provide humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. The U.S. only says the two sides talked about assistance. Well, under the Taliban, a feared and hated police department called the Ministry of Virtue and Vice has returned with a vengeance. So what does this mean for women, Christians, and other minorities? George Thomas explains.
Mariam, not her real name, emerged after days of hiding to withdraw money from a bank in Kabul when she, along with dozens of other women standing in line, were suddenly surrounded by armed Taliban fighters.
They told me and the women standing around me that they wanted to kill us all.
In an exclusive interview with CBN News, Mariam, a Christian convert from Islam, told us she thought she was going to die.
They called us infidels, that we weren't Islamic enough, and wanted to know why we had left our homes without our husbands.
The Taliban fired their weapons into the air to disperse the women.
God really protected us. The owner of the bank quickly opened the doors so we could rush in for safety.
The frightening moment happening shortly after the Taliban announced their new government leaders. Among them, by the way, 4 radical Islamists who once served in Guantanamo Bay on terrorism-related charges.
This is a cabinet that only al-Qaeda could love.
The new man tapped to run Afghanistan's internal security, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is on the FBI's most wanted list and comes from a family accused of killing Americans and Afghan civilians.
The Haqqani network is one of the most formidable and murderous terrorist networks in the world.
The FBI has a $10 million reward for information leading to Haqqani's arrest.
The FBI no longer needs to wonder about his location. He's going to be helping to govern from Kabul.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken warning that this new Taliban government will have to earn its legitimacy.
We understand the Taliban has presented this as a caretaker cabinet. We will judge it and them by its actions.
On the streets of Kabul and other big cities, protest and outrage against the new hardline government.
These are dark days in my country. These are all dangerous people. These are terrorists who are blacklisted.
Tawfiq, also a Christian convert from Islam, told CBN News in an exclusive interview from Kabul that neither the United States nor any other foreign government should give the Taliban legitimacy.
How can they? The Taliban have crazy Islamic ideas and don't believe in human rights.
The all-male leadership also disbanded the Ministry of Women's Affairs and reinstated the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, one of the most feared and hated departments during the Taliban's last regime. Its forces would regularly beat, stone, and hang women in public.
The Ministry of Vice and Virtue has a horrific history, and some of the worst atrocities under Taliban rule in the 90s can be traced back to that ministry and people associated with it. They're the ones that were responsible for putting women in soccer stadiums and stoning them to death.
The Taliban has also once again banned women's sports, claiming that it goes against Islam's Sharia law.
Islam and the Islamic Emirate do not allow women to play cricket or play the kind of sports where they get exposed. We will not ignore Islamic values, even if it causes opposition. We will not leave our Islamic rules.
Mariam says the encounter with the Taliban fighters at the bank really shook her up. She, along with 20 other Christians, are crammed in a house in Kabul, hiding from the regime's fighters and pondering their uncertain future.
I know that the Taliban are strict Islamic believers, but I'm asking Christians around the world to pray for the Taliban, that the Lord would touch their hearts and someday they will know the real kingdom of God and the real king of the world, and that's Jesus.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Dark days for Lebanon, how a blackout hints of political unrest in the country when Faith Nation returns. In Lebanon, the electric grid is back online tonight after the army supplied fuel to 2 key power stations there. A massive blackout hit over the weekend when the state power plants ran out of fuel, leading to protests in the country. As Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, the power outage is just one more sign of Lebanon on the verge of economic and political collapse.
The blackout plunged Beirut, once known as the Paris of the Middle East, into the dark. For a time, car headlights became the main source of light.
We used to have electricity for an hour daily. Now it's totally cut. We're spending our time outside our homes so our children can have fun. The situation is getting worse. May God protect us as we don't know where we're heading.
The lack of power represents a crisis for hospitals, essential services, and ordinary people trying to keep their refrigerators running and food from spoiling. Last week, Jordan agreed to supply electricity to Lebanon, but that deal could take months to implement. The energy crisis is part of a larger political and economic crisis where Lebanon's currency has lost 90% of its value. Recently, these depositors stormed this bank in central Beirut after the bank blocked their money.
I'm demanding my right and my money. All my years of work were robbed. They robbed people's work and they put them in the name of their children abroad.
A new government took office recently, the first since the massive explosion in August 2020 that devastated the city of Beirut. But Israeli analyst and retired Brigadier General Asaf Orion told CBN News Lebanon is not only a failed state, but a fake state, because the terrorist group Hezbollah is the real power inside the country.
They're running the show. They allow legitimate veneer of Christians, Sunnis, and others to take part in this facade. And as long as the world buys it and keeps on paying, it will keep on rolling.
In the meantime, the Lebanese people are suffering through an economic crisis the World Bank says is one of the worst in the world in the past 150 years. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
A race to the finish line. Runners mark the 125th Boston Marathon. Next on Faith Nation. And finally tonight, better late than never, the Boston Marathon is back. Last year, during the height of the COVID crisis, the race went completely virtual. But today, runners from around the world hit the streets of the Massachusetts capital for the historic event. The 2021 race marked the 125th anniversary of the marathon, and this year was one for the history books. For the first time ever, athletes got to experience Boston in the fall after the pandemic postponed the event about 6 months from the typical April race. And that's going to do it for Faith Nation. We hope you have a great night.